qui était diamétralement opposé à celui que vous pratiquez aujourd'hui, même si vous continuez vos activités à côté?
Alors, je dirais que c'est à double tranchant. Quand on est enfant et qu'on voit son père écrire, ça paraît finalement quelque chose de familier, de possible, de réalisable. Très jeune, j'ai commencé à écrire. Je me souviens quand j'avais une dizaine d'années, on avait un guignol avec des marionnettes et j'écrivais des petites pièces de théâtre là d'abord. Et puis à l'âge de 25 ans, ça m'a travaillé encore. J'ai écrit un roman, je vois un peu de ce qui n'était pas bon. Et ça a mis beaucoup de temps en fait à venir, parce qu'effectivement, quand on a comme ça un père très connu et qui est écrivain, on s'est dit on ne pourra jamais jouer dans la même cour. Donc c'est assez délicat et assez difficile, de façon sans doute assez symptomatique. Finalement, j'ai publié mon premier roman qu'après sa mort, c'est-à-dire quand son regard n'était plus. Je sais pas, il aurait peut-être apprécié mes romans, j'en sais rien, mais c'est quand même assez difficile, oui, d'être fils d'un écrivain et de devenir écrivain soi-même.
Il y a un rapport avec les sentiments aussi, très exacerbé, mais en même temps avec une énorme pudeur. On sent que ça fait partie de votre personnalité.
Bien sûr, c'est vrai que je suis un solitaire, donc je ne m'ouvre pas très facilement, je ne parle pas énormément de moi-même. Voilà, vous m'y forcez.
Désolé.
Mais voilà, c'est pas mon caractère, c'est vrai, de parler de moi. Et pourtant, évidemment, comme tout le monde, je suis assailli de sentiments de toutes parts. On n'est que ça, les êtres humains. Les personnages ont des tas de sentiments aussi, d'émotions qu'ils ressentent, que j'essaie de faire passer. C'est peut-être d'ailleurs ma façon à moi d'exprimer des émotions, c'est-à-dire par le roman plutôt que
il y a un peu de votre père dans cette écriture.
Ça, je pense, oui. Oui, j'ai certainement été influencé par lui de ce côté-là.
Le fait d'avoir reçu des prix, est-ce que ça vous a permis quand même une validation et notamment de regarder là-haut en disant je suis reconnu?
Oui, c'est important les prix. En même temps, ils ne produisent pas vraiment d'effet sur moi, pas sur l'écriture, ni sur ma façon de penser, ni sur ma façon d'être. Mais c'est vrai que c'est une reconnaissance, hein, vous le dites, c'est ça. C'est-à-dire que quelque part, il y a toujours au-dessus de moi cette ombre tutélaire qui est mon père. Si on me donne un prix, effectivement, je me dis, bon voilà, je suis par moi-même, je ne suis pas seulement un nom, j'ai aussi un prénom. C'est important pour moi.
Merci beaucoup, Olivier Maire, d'être passé par ici.
Merci.
Ça s'appelle Dans l'ombre du loup, paru aux éditions XO. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
France Info Météo, avec le CIC, banque d'une PME sur 3.
Adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The Return of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The Adventure of the Empty House. It was in the spring of the year 1894 that all London was interested and the fashionable world dismayed by the murder of the Honourable Ronald Adair under the most unusual and inexplicable circumstances. The public has already learned those particulars of the crime which came out in the police investigation, but a good deal was suppressed upon that occasion, since the case for the prosecution was so overwhelmingly strong that it was not necessary to bring forward all the facts. Only now, at the end of nearly 10 years, am I allowed to supply those missing links which make up the whole of that remarkable chain. The crime was of interest in itself, but that interest was as nothing to me compared to the inconceivable sequel, which afforded me the greatest shock and surprise of any event in my adventurous life. Even now, after this long interval, I find myself thrilling as I think of it, and feeling once more that sudden flood of joy, amazement, and incredulity which utterly submerged my mind. Let me say to that public, which has shown some interest in those glimpses which I have occasionally given them of the thoughts and actions of a very remarkable man, that they are not to blame me if I have not shared my knowledge with them, for I should have considered it my first duty to do so, had I not been barred by a positive prohibition from his own lips, which was only withdrawn upon the 3rd of last month. It can be imagined that my close intimacy with Sherlock Holmes had interested me deeply in crime, and that after his disappearance I never failed to read with care the various problems which came before the public. And I even attempted, more than once, for my own private satisfaction, to employ his methods in their solution, though with indifferent success. There was none, however, which appealed to me like this tragedy of Ronald Adair. As I read the evidence at the inquest, which led up to the verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown, I realized more clearly than I had ever done the loss which the community had sustained, by the death of Sherlock Holmes. There were points about this strange business which would, I was sure, have specially appealed to him, and the efforts of the police would have been supplemented or more probably anticipated by the trained observation and the alert mind of the first criminal agent in Europe. All day, as I drove upon my round, I turned over the case in my mind and found no explanation which appeared to me to be adequate. At the risk of telling a twice-told tale, I will recapitulate the facts as they were known to the public at the conclusion of the inquest. The Honourable Ronald Adair was the second son of the Earl of Maynooth, at that time governor of one of the Australian colonies. Adair's mother had returned from Australia to undergo the operation for cataract, and she, her son Ronald, and her daughter Hilda were living together at 427 Park Lane. The youth moved in the best society, had, so far as was known, no enemies and no particular vices. He had been engaged to Miss Edith Woodley of Carstairs, but the engagement had been broken off by mutual consent some months before, and there was no sign that it had left any very profound feeling behind it. For the rest, the man's life moved in a narrow and conventional circle, for his habits were quiet and his nature unemotional. Yet it was upon this easy-going young aristocrat that death came, in most strange and unexpected form, between the hours of 10 and 11:20 on the night of March the 30th, 1894. Ronald Adair was fond of cards, playing continually, but never for such stakes as would hurt him. He was a member of the Baldwin, the Cavendish, and the Bagatelle card clubs. It was shown that after dinner on the day of his death, he had played a rubber of whist at the latter club. He had also played there in the afternoon. The evidence of those who had played with him, Mr. Murray, Sir John Hardy, and Colonel Moran, showed that the game was whist and that there was a fairly equal fall of the cards. Adair might have lost £5, but not more. His fortune was a considerable one, and such a loss could not in any way affect him. He had played nearly every day at one club or other, but he was a cautious player and usually rose a winner. It came out in evidence that, in partnership with Colonel Moran, he had actually won as much as £420 in a sitting some weeks before from Godfrey Milner and Lord Balmoral. So much for his recent history as it came out at the inquest. On the evening of the crime, he returned from the club exactly at 10. His mother and sister were out spending the evening with a relation. The servant deposed that she heard him enter the front room on the second floor, generally used as his sitting room. She had lit a fire there, and as it smoked, she had opened the window. No sound was heard from the room until 11:20, the hour of the return of Lady Maynooth and her daughter. Desiring to say good night, she attempted to enter her son's room. The door was locked on the inside, and no answer could be got to their cries and knocking. Help was obtained, and the door forced. The unfortunate young man was found lying near the table. His head had been horribly mutilated by an expanding revolver bullet, but no weapon of any sort was to be found.
Gagné, non, c'est pas un jour gagné, c'est aussi un jour de perdu, dans la mesure où on est à un niveau, vous l'avez vu, d'habitude les chiffres du lundi sont faibles. On est...
Tougher, huh? Please.
Well, it's not a question of that, ma'am. We have to find him. We're going to need all the cooperation we can get.
50 décès, ce n'est pas des chiffres.
For £10 each, and £17.10 in silver and gold, the money arranged in little piles of varying amount. There were some figures also upon a sheet of paper with the names of some club friends opposite to them, from which it was conjectured that before his death he was endeavouring to make out his losses or winnings at cards. A minute examination of the circumstances served only to make the case more complex. In the first place, No reason could be given why the young man should have fastened the door upon the inside. There was the possibility that the murderer had done this and had afterwards escaped by the window. The drop was at least 20 feet, however, and a bed of crocuses in full bloom lay beneath. Neither the flowers nor the earth showed any sign of having been disturbed, nor were there any marks upon the narrow strip of grass which separated the house from the road. Apparently, therefore, it was the young man himself who had fastened the door. But how did he come by his death? No one could have climbed up to the window without leaving traces. Suppose a man had fired through the window, he would indeed be a remarkable shot who could with a revolver inflict so deadly a wound. Again, Park Lane is a frequented thoroughfare. There is a cab stand within 100 yards of the house. No one had heard a shot, and yet there was the dead man, and there the revolver bullet, which had mushroomed out as soft-nosed bullets will, and so inflicted a wound which must have caused instantaneous death. Such were the circumstances of the Park Lane mystery, which were further complicated by entire absence of motive, since, as I have said,
File 2. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
the place was pitch dark, but it was evident to me that it was an empty house. Our feet creaked and crackled over the bare planking, and my outstretched hand touched a wall from which the paper was hanging in ribbons. Holmes's cold, thin fingers closed round my wrist and led me forward down a long hall until I dimly saw the murky fanlight over the door. Here, Holmes turned suddenly to the right, and we found ourselves in a large, square, empty room, heavily...
File 3. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The Adventure of the Norwood Builder.
File 4. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
This place, Deep Dean House.
File 5. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The Adventure of the Dancing Men.
File 6. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The two women told their story.
File 7. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist.
Another fucking weirdo.
File 8. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
Holmes's quiet day in the country had a singular termination, for he arrived at Baker Street late in the evening with a cut lip and a discoloured lump upon his forehead, besides a general air of dissipation which would have made his own person the fitting object of a Scotland Yard investigation. He was immensely tickled by his own adventures and laughed heartily as he recounted them. "I get so little active exercise that it is always a treat," said he. "You are aware that I have some proficiency in the good old British sport of boxing. Occasionally it is of service. Today, for example, I should have come to very ignominious grief without it." I begged him to tell me what had occurred. I found that country pub which I had already recommended to your notice, and there I made my discreet inquiries. I was in the bar, and a garrulous landlord was giving me all that I wanted. Williamson is a white-bearded man, and he lives alone with a small staff of servants at the hall. There is some rumour that he is, or has been, a clergyman, but one or two incidents of his short residence at the hall struck me as peculiar.
File 9. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The Adventure of the Priory School. We have had some dramatic entrances and exits upon our small stage at Baker.
File 11. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
A red square of light had sprung out of the darkness. In the middle of it was the black figure of the secretary, his head advanced, peering out into the night.
File 12. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The Adventure of Black Peter. I have never known my friend to be an...
File 10. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
There was an agitated knock at the door.
File 14. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The Adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton. It is years since the incidents of which I speak took place, and yet it is with diffidence that I allude to them. For a long time, even with the utmost discretion and reticence, it would have been impossible to make the facts public. But now the principal person concerned is beyond the reach of human law, and with due suppression, the story may be told in such a fashion as to injure no one. It records an absolutely unique experience in the career both of Mr. Sherlock Holmes and of myself. The reader will excuse me if I conceal the date or any other fact by which he might trace the actual occurrence. We had been out for one of our evening rambles, Holmes and I, and had returned about 6 o'clock on a cold, frosty winter's evening. As Holmes turned up the lamp, the light fell upon a card on the table. He glanced at it, and then, with an ejaculation of disgust, threw it on the floor. I picked it up and read, Charles Augustus Milverton, Appledore Towers, Hampstead. Agent. Who is he? I asked. The worst man in London, Holmes answered, as he sat down and stretched his legs before the fire. Is anything on the back of the card? I turned it over. Will...
File 15.
This is our title, but the name
No
of the
adverts
story.
from audiobooksforfree.com.
I don't know what that was.
Holmes and I put on our dress clothes so that we might appear to be two theatre-goers homeward bound. In Oxford Street, we picked up a hansom and drove to an address in Hampstead. Here we paid off our cab, and with our greatcoats buttoned up, for it was bitterly cold and the wind seemed to blow through us, we walked along the edge of the heath. It's a business that needs delicate treatment, said Holmes. These documents are contained in a safe in the fellow's study, and the study is the anteroom of his bedchamber. On the other hand, like all these stout little men who do themselves well, he is a plethoric sleeper. Agatha, that's my fiancée, says it is a joke in the servants' hall that it's impossible to wake the master. He has a secretary who is devoted to his interests and never budges from the study all day. That's why we are going at night. Then he has a beast of a dog which roams the garden. I met Agatha late the last 2 evenings, and she locks the brute up so as to give me a clear run. This is the house, this big one in its own grounds. Through the gate, now to the right among the laurels. We might put on our masks here, I think. You see, there is not a glimmer of light in any of the windows, and everything is working splendidly. With our black silk face coverings, which turned us into two of the most truculent figures in London, we stole up to the silent, gloomy house. A sort of tiled veranda extended along one side of it, lined by several windows and 2 doors. That's his bedroom, Holmes whispered. This door opens straight into the study. It would suit us best, but it is bolted as well as locked, and we should make too much noise getting in. Come round here. There's a greenhouse which opens into the drawing room. The place was locked, but Holmes removed a circle of glass and turned the key from the inside. An instant afterwards, he had closed the door behind us, and we had become felons in the eyes of the law. The thick, warm air of the conservatory and the rich, choking fragrance of exotic plants took us by the throat. He seized my hand in the darkness and led me swiftly past banks of shrubs which brushed against our faces. Holmes had remarkable powers, carefully cultivated, of seeing in the dark. Still holding my hand in one of his, he opened a door, and I was vaguely conscious that we had entered a large room in which a cigar had been smoked not long before. He felt his way among the furniture, opened another door, and closed it behind us. Putting out my hand, I felt several coats hanging from the wall, and I understood that I was in a passage. We passed along it, and Holmes very gently opened a door upon the right-hand side. Something rushed out at us, and my heart sprang into my mouth, and I could have laughed when I realized that it was the cat. A fire was burning in this new room, and again the air was heavy with tobacco smoke. Holmes entered on tiptoe, waited for me to follow, and then very gently closed the door. We were in Milverton's study, and a portiere at the farther side showed the entrance to his bedroom. It was a good fire, and the room was illuminated by it. Near the door, I saw the gleam of an electric switch, but it was unnecessary, even if it had been safe, to turn it on. At one side of the fireplace was a heavy curtain which covered the bay window we had seen from outside. On the other side was the door which communicated with the veranda. A desk stood in the center with a turning chair of shining red leather. Opposite was a large bookcase with a marble bust of Athene on the top. In the corner, between the bookcase and the wall, there stood a tall, green safe, the firelight flashing back from the polished brass knobs upon its face. Holmes stole across and looked at it. Then he crept to the door of the bedroom and stood with slanting head, listening intently. No sound came from within. Meanwhile, it had struck me that it would be wise to secure our retreat through the outer door, so I examined it. To my amazement, it was neither locked nor bolted. I touched Holmes on the arm, and he turned his masked face in that direction. I saw him start, and he was evidently as surprised as I. "I don't like it," he whispered, putting his lips to my very ear. "I can't quite make it out. Anyhow, we have no time to lose. Can I do anything?" "Yes. Stand by the door. If you hear anyone come, bolt it on the inside, and we can get away as we came. If they come the other way, we can get through the door if our job is done, or hide behind these window curtains if it is not. Do you understand?" I nodded and stood by the door. My first feeling of fear had passed away, and I thrilled now with a keener zest than I had ever enjoyed when we were the defenders of the law instead of its defiers. The high object of our mission, the consciousness that it was unselfish and chivalrous, the villainous character of our opponent, all added to the sporting interest of the adventure. Far from feeling guilty, I rejoiced and exulted in our dangers. With a glow of admiration, I watched Holmes unrolling his case of instruments and choosing his tool with the calm, scientific accuracy of a surgeon who performs a delicate operation. I knew that the opening of safes was a particular hobby with him, and I understood the joy which it gave him to be confronted with this green and gold monster, the dragon which held in its maw the reputations of many fair ladies. Turning up the cuffs of his dress coat, he had placed his overcoat on a chair, Holmes laid out 2 drills, a jemmy, and several skeleton keys. I stood at the center door with my eyes glancing at each of the others, ready for any emergency, though indeed my plans were somewhat vague as to what I should do if we were interrupted. For half an hour, Holmes worked with concentrated energy, laying down one tool, picking up another, handling each with the strength and delicacy of the trained mechanic. Finally, I heard a click. The broad green door swung open, and inside I had a glimpse of a number of paper packets, each tied, sealed, and inscribed. Holmes picked one out, but it was hard to read by the flickering fire, and he drew out his little dark lantern, for it was too dangerous with Milverton in the next room to switch on the electric light. Suddenly, I saw him halt, listen intently, and then, in an instant, he had swung the door of the safe to, picked up his coat, stuffed his tools into the pockets, and darted behind the window curtain, motioning me to do the same. It was only when I had joined him there that I heard what had alarmed his quicker senses. There was a noise somewhere within the house. A door slammed in the distance. Then a confused, dull murmur broke itself into the measured thud of heavy footsteps rapidly approaching. They were in the passage outside the room. They paused at the door. The door opened. There was a sharp snick as the electric light was turned on. The door closed once more, and the pungent reek of a strong cigar was borne to our nostrils. Then the The footsteps continued backward and forward, within a few yards of us. Finally, there was a creak from a chair, and the footsteps ceased. Then a key clicked in a lock, and I heard the rustle of papers. So far, I had not dared to look out, but now I gently parted the division of the curtains in front of me and peeped through. From the pressure of Holmes's shoulder against mine, I knew that he was sharing my observations. Right in front of us, and almost within our reach, was the broad, rounded back of Milverton. It was evident that we had entirely miscalculated his movements, that he had never been to his bedroom, but that he had been sitting up in some smoking or billiard room in the farther wing of the house, the windows of which we had not seen. His broad, grizzled head, with its shining patch of baldness, was in the immediate foreground of our vision. He was leaning far back in the red leather chair, his legs outstretched, a long black cigar projecting at an angle from his mouth. He wore a semi-military smoking jacket, claret-colored, with a black velvet collar. In his hand, he held a long legal document which he was reading in an indolent fashion, blowing rings of tobacco smoke from his lips as he did so. There was no promise of a speedy departure in his composed bearing and his comfortable attitude. I felt Holmes's hand steal into mine and give me a reassuring shake, as if to say that the situation was within his powers and that he was easy in his mind. I was not sure whether he had seen what was only too obvious from my position, that the door of the safe was imperfectly closed, and that Milverton might at any moment observe it. In my own mind, I had determined that if I was sure from the rigidity of his gaze that it had caught his eye, I would at once spring out, throw my great coat over his head, pinion him, and leave the rest to Holmes. But Milverton never looked up. He was languidly interested by the papers in his hand, and page after page was turned as he followed the argument of the lawyer. At least, I thought, when he has finished the document and the cigar, he will go to his room. But before he had reached the end of either, there came a remarkable development which turned our thoughts into quite another channel. Several times I had observed that Milverton looked at his watch, and once he had risen and sat down again with a gesture of impatience. The idea, however, that he might have an appointment at so strange an hour never occurred to me until a faint sound reached my ears from the veranda outside. Milverton dropped his papers and sat rigid in his chair. The sound was repeated, and then there came a gentle tap at the door. Milverton rose and opened it. "Well," said he curtly, "you are nearly half an hour late." So this was the explanation of the unlocked door and of the nocturnal vigil of Milverton. There was the gentle rustle of a woman's dress. I had closed the slit between the curtains as Milverton's face had turned in our direction, but now I ventured very carefully to open it once more. He had resumed his seat, the cigar still projecting at an insolent angle from the corner of his mouth. In front of him, in the full glare of the electric light, there stood a tall, slim, dark woman, a veil over her face, a mantle drawn round her chin. Her breath came quick and fast, and every inch of the lithe figure was quivering with strong emotion. "Well," said Milverton, "you made me lose a good night's rest, my dear. I hope you prove worth it. You couldn't come any other time, eh?" The woman shook her head. "Well, if you couldn't, you couldn't. If the Countess is a hard mistress, you have your chance to get level with her now. Bless the girl, what are you shivering about? That's right, pull yourself together. Now, let us get down to business." He took a notebook from the drawer of his desk. "You say that you have 5 letters which compromise the Countess d'Albert. You want to sell them. I want to buy them. So far, so good. It only remains to fix a price. I should want to inspect the letters, of course. If they are really good specimens... Great heavens! Is it you?" The woman, without a word, had raised her veil and dropped the mantle from her chin. It was a dark, handsome, clear-cut face which confronted Milverton. A face with a curved nose, strong, dark eyebrows shading hard, glittering eyes, and a straight, thin-lipped mouth set in a dangerous smile. "It is I," she said, "the woman whose life you have ruined." Milverton laughed, but fear vibrated in his voice. "You were so very obstinate," said he. "Why did you drive me to such extremities? I assure you I wouldn't hurt a fly of my own accord, but every man has his business, and what was I to do? I put the price well within your means. You would not pay. So you sent the letters to my husband, and he, the the noblest gentleman that ever lived, a man whose boots I was never worthy to lace. He broke his gallant heart and died. You remember that last night when I came through that door? I begged and prayed you for mercy, and you laughed in my face as you are trying to laugh now, only your coward heart cannot keep your lips from twitching. Yes, you never thought to see me here again, but it was that night which taught me how I could meet you face to face and alone. Well, Charles Milverton, what have you to say? Don't imagine that you can bully me, said he, rising to his feet. I have only to raise my voice, and I can call my servants and have you arrested. But I will make allowance for your natural anger. Leave the room at once as you came, and I will say no more. The woman stood with her hand buried in her bosom, and the same deadly smile on her thin lips. You will ruin no more lives as you have ruined mine. You will wring no more hearts as you wrung mine. I will free the world of a poisonous thing. Take that, you hound, and that, and that, and that, and that. She had drawn a little gleaming revolver and emptied barrel after barrel into Milverton's body, the muzzle within 2 feet of his shirt front. He shrank away and then fell forward upon the table, coughing furiously and clawing among the papers. Then he staggered to his feet, received another shot, and rolled upon the floor. "You've done me," he cried, and lay still. The woman looked at him intently and ground her heel into his upturned face. She looked again, but there was no sound or movement. I heard a sharp rustle. The night air blew into the heated room, and the avenger was gone. No interference upon our part could have saved the man from his fate. But as the woman poured bullet after bullet into Milverton's shrinking body, I was about to spring out when I felt Holmes's cold, strong grasp upon my wrist. I understood the whole argument of that firm, restraining grip, that it was no affair of ours, that justice had overtaken the villain, that we had our own duties and our own objects, which were not to be lost sight of. But hardly had the woman rushed from the room when Holmes, with swift, silent steps, was over at the other door. He turned the key in the lock. At the same instant, we heard voices in the house and the sound of hurrying feet. The revolver shots had roused the household. With perfect coolness, Holmes slipped across to the safe, filled his 2 arms with bundles of letters, and poured them all into the fire. Again and again he did it until the safe was empty. Someone turned the handle and beat upon the outside of the door. Holmes looked swiftly round. The letter, which had been the messenger of death for Milverton, lay all mottled with his blood upon the table. Holmes tossed it in among the blazing papers. Then he drew the key from the outer door, passed through after me, and locked it on the outside. "This way, Watson," said he. "We can scale the garden wall in this direction." I could not have believed that an alarm could have spread so swiftly. Looking back, the huge house was one blaze of light. The front door was open, and figures were rushing down the drive. The whole garden was alive with people, and one fellow raised a view halloo as we emerged from the veranda, and followed hard at our heels. Holmes seemed to know the ground perfectly, and he threaded his way swiftly among a plantation of small trees, I close at his heels, and our foremost pursuer panting behind us. It was a 6-foot wall which barred our path, but he sprang to the top and over. As I did the same, I felt the hand of the man behind me grab at my ankle, but I kicked myself free and scrambled over a grass-strewn coping. I fell upon my face among some bushes, but Holmes had me on my feet in an instant, and together we dashed away across the huge expanse of Hampstead Heath. We had run 2 miles, I suppose, before Holmes at last halted and listened intently. All was absolute silence behind us. We had shaken off our pursuers and were safe. We had breakfasted and were smoking our morning pipe on the day after the remarkable experience which I have recorded, when Mr. Lestrade of Scotland Yard, very solemn and impressive, was ushered into our modest sitting room. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Good morning. May I ask if you are very busy just now?" "Not too busy to listen to you." "I thought that perhaps if you had nothing particular on hand, you might care to assist us in a most remarkable case which occurred only last night at Hampstead." "Dear me," said Holmes. "What was that?" "A murder, a most dramatic and remarkable murder. I know how keen you are upon these things, and I would take it as a great favour if you would step down to Appledore Towers and give us the benefit of your advice. It is no ordinary crime. We have had our eyes upon this Mr. Milverton for some time. And between ourselves, he was a bit of a villain. He is known to have held papers which he used for blackmailing purposes. These papers have all been burned by the murderers. No article of value was taken, as it is probable that the criminals were men of good position whose sole object was to prevent social exposure. Criminals, said Holmes.
Whoa,
Plural.
buddy!
Yes, there were 2 of them. They were as nearly as possible kept red-handed. We have their footmarks, we have their description, which 10 to 1 that we trace them. The first fellow was a bit too active, but the second was caught by the undergardener and only got away after a struggle. He was a middle-sized, strongly built man. Square jaw, thick neck, moustache, a mask over his eyes. It's rather vague, said Sherlock Holmes. Why, it might be a description of Watson. It's true, said the inspector with amusement. It might be a description of Watson. Well, I'm afraid I can't help you, Lestrade, said Holmes. The fact is that I knew this fellow Milverton, that I considered him one of the most dangerous men in London, and that I think there are certain crimes which the law cannot touch, and which therefore, to some extent, justify private revenge. No, it's no use arguing. I've made up my mind. My sympathies are with the criminals rather than with the victim, and I will not handle this case. Holmes had not said one word to me about the tragedy which we had witnessed, but I observed all the morning that he was in his most thoughtful mood, and he gave me the impression from his vacant eyes and his abstracted manner of a man who was striving to recall something to his memory. We were in the middle of our lunch when he suddenly sprang to his feet. "By Jove, Watson, I've got it!" he cried. "Take your hat, come with me!" He hurried at his top speed down Baker Street and along Oxford Street until we had almost reached Regent Circus. Here, on the left hand, there stands a shop window filled with photographs of the celebrities and beauties of the day. Holmes's eyes fixed themselves upon one of them, and following his gaze, I saw the picture of a regal and stately lady in court dress, with a high diamond tiara upon her noble head. I looked at that delicately curved nose, at the marked eyebrows, at the straight mouth, and the strong little chin beneath it. Then I caught my breath as I read the time-honored title of the great nobleman and statesman whose wife she had been. My eyes met those of Holmes, and he put his finger to his lips as we turned away from the window.
File 16. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The Adventure of the 6 Napoleons. It was no very unusual thing for Mr. Lestrade of Scotland Yard.
Come with me to Snowshoe Pass and repeat your story before Corporal Hayden.
Were welcome to Sherlock Holmes,
But I
and
wish
enabled him to keep in touch with.
The following morning, Sergeant Preston and Andy McDermott confronted Corporal Hayden in the cabin that served both as his office of Snowshoe Pass. As that, Sergeant. And I can understand just how Andy must feel, but I swear I wasn't the man who robbed the safe.
Can you offer any explanation of how a crook might resemble you so closely?
None at all.
You haven't a twin brother by any chance?
Oh, I haven't got any brothers or sisters either, let alone a twin.
Have any other robberies occurred recently?
Well, that's an interesting point, Sergeant.
What do you mean?
As a matter of fact, there's been a whole series of robberies in this district lately.
Any line on who committed them?
Now, to tell the truth, they've got me completely stumped. Do you think there might be some connection between those jobs and the robbery at Andy's trading post?
A possibility.
All that was going on at the police headquarters. In return for the news which this...
File 16. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The Adventure of the 6 Napoleons. It was no very unusual thing for Mr. Lestrade of Scotland Yard to look in upon us of an evening, and his visits were welcome to Sherlock Holmes, for they enabled him to keep in touch with all that was going on at the police headquarters. In return for the news which Lestrade would bring, Holmes was always ready to listen with attention to the details of any case upon which the detective was engaged, and was able occasionally, without any active interference, to give some hint or suggestion drawn from his own vast knowledge and experience. On this particular evening, Lestrade had spoken of the weather and the newspapers. Then he had fallen silent, puffing thoughtfully at his cigar. Holmes looked keenly at him. "Anything remarkable on hand?" he asked. "Oh, no, Mr. Holmes. Nothing very particular." "Then tell me about it." Lestrade laughed. "Well, Mr. Holmes, there is no use denying that there is something on my mind. And yet it is such an absurd business that I hesitated to bother you about it. On the other hand, although it is trivial, it is undoubtedly queer, and I know that you have a taste for all that is.
File 17. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The afternoon was far advanced.
File 18. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The adventure of the three students.
I thought that was the one about the school.
File 19. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
3 yellow squares of light shone above us in the gathering gloom.
File 20. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The adventure of the golden pince-nez. When I look at the 3 massive manuscript volumes which contain our work for the year 1894, I confess that it is very difficult for me, out of such a wealth of material, to select the cases which are most interesting in themselves, and at the same time most conducive to a
File 20. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The adventure of the golden pince-nez. When I look at the 3 massive...
File 21. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
We passed down the passage which was of the same length as that which led to the garden. At the end was a short flight of steps ending in a door. Our guide knocked and then ushered us into the professor's bedroom. It was a very large chamber lined with a new...
File 21. File 22. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The adventure of the missing 3/4. We were fairly...
File 23. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
It was already dark when we reached the old university.
File 24. No adverts from audiobooksforfree.com.
The adventure of the Abbey Grange. It was on a bitterly cold night and frosty morning towards the end of the winter of '97 that I was awakened by a tugging at my shoulder. It was Holmes. The candle in his hand shone upon his eager, stooping face and told me at a glance that something was amiss. "Come, Watson, come," he cried. "The game is afoot. Not a word. Into your clothes and come." 10 minutes later, we were both in a cab and rattling through the silent streets on our way to Charing Cross Station. The first faint winter's dawn was beginning to appear, and we could dimly see the occasional figure of an early workman as he passed us, blurred and indistinct in the opalescent London reek. Holmes nestled in silence into his heavy coat, and I was glad to do the same, for the air was most bitter, and neither of us had broken our fast. It was not until we had consumed some hot tea at the station and taken our places in the Kentish train that we were sufficiently thawed, he to speak and I to listen. Holmes drew a note from his pocket and read aloud, "Abbey Grange, Marsham, Kent, 3:30 a.m. My dear Mr. Holmes, I should be very glad of your immediate assistance in what promises to be a most remarkable case. It is something quite in your line. Except for releasing the lady, I will see that everything is kept exactly as I have found it, but I beg you not to lose an instant, as it is difficult to leave Sir Eustace there. Yours faithfully, Stanley Hopkins. Hopkins has called me in 7 times, and on each occasion his summons has been entirely justified, said Holmes. I fancy that every one of his cases has found its way into your collection, and I must admit, Watson, that you have some power of selection which atones for much which I deplore in your narratives. Your fatal habit of looking at everything from the point of view of a story instead of as a scientific exercise has ruined what might have been an instructive and even classical series of demonstrations. You slur over work of the utmost finesse and delicacy in order to dwell upon sensational details which may excite but cannot possibly instruct the reader. Why do you not write them yourself? I said with some bitterness. I will, my dear Watson, I will. At present I am, as you know, fairly busy, but I propose to devote my declining years to the composition of a textbook which shall focus the whole art of detection into one volume. Our present research appears to be a case of murder. You think this Sir Eustace is dead, then? I should say so. Hopkins' writing shows considerable agitation, and he is not an emotional man. Yes, I gather there has been violence, and that the body is left for our inspection. A mere suicide would not have caused him to send for me. As to the release of the lady, it would appear that she has been locked in her room during the tragedy. We are moving in high life, Watson. Crackling paper, E.B. monogram, coat of arms, picturesque address. I think that friend Hopkins will live up to his reputation, and that we shall have an interesting morning. The crime was committed before 12 last night. How can you possibly tell? By an inspection of the trains, and by reckoning the time. The local police had to be called in, they had to communicate with Scotland Yard, Hopkins had to go out, and he in turn had to send for me. All that makes a fair night's work. Well, here we are at Chislehurst Station, and we shall soon set our doubts at rest. A drive of a couple of miles through narrow country lanes brought us to a park gate, which was opened for us by an old lodge-keeper, whose haggard face bore the reflection of some great disaster. The avenue ran through a noble park, between lines of ancient elms, and ended in a low, widespread house, pillared in front after the fashion of Palladio. The central part was evidently of a great age and shrouded in ivy, but the large windows showed that modern changes had been carried out, and one wing of the house appeared to be entirely new. The youthful figure and alert, eager face of Inspector Stanley Hopkins confronted us in the open doorway. I'm very glad you have come, Mr. Holmes, and you too, Dr. Watson. But indeed, if I had my time over again, I should not have troubled you. For since the lady has come to herself, she has given so clear an account of the affair that there is not much left for us to do. You remember that Lewisham gang of burglars? What, the 3 Randalls? Exactly, the father and 2 sons. It's their work, I have not a doubt of it. They did a job at Sydenham a fortnight ago, and were seen and described. Rather cool to do another so soon and so near, but it is they, beyond all doubt. It's a hanging matter this time. Sir Eustace is dead, then? Yes, his head was knocked in with his own poker. Sir Eustace Brackensall, the driver tells me. Exactly. One of the richest men in Kent. Lady Brackenstall is in the morning room. Poor lady, she has had a most dreadful experience. She seemed half dead when I saw her first. I think you had best see her and hear her account of the facts. Then we will examine the dining room together. Lady Brackenstall was no ordinary person. Seldom have I seen so graceful a figure, so womanly a presence, and so beautiful a face. She was a blonde, golden-haired, blue-eyed, and would no doubt have had the perfect complexion which goes with such colouring, had not her recent experience left her drawn and haggard. Her sufferings were physical as well as mental, for over one eye rose a hideous plum-coloured swelling, which her maid, a tall, austere woman, was bathing assiduously with vinegar and water. The lady lay back, exhausted, upon a couch, but her quick, observant gaze as we entered the room, and the alert expression of her beautiful features, showed that neither her wits nor her courage had been shaken by her terrible experience. She was enveloped in a loose dressing gown of blue and silver, but a black sequin-covered dinner dress lay upon the couch beside her. "I have told you all that happened, Mr. Hopkins," she said wearily. "Could you not repeat it for me?" "Well, if you think it necessary, I will tell these gentlemen what occurred. Have they been in the dining room yet?" "I thought they had better hear your ladyship's story first." "I shall be glad when you can arrange matters. It is horrible to me to think of him still lying there." She shuddered and buried her face in her hands. As she did so, the loose gown fell back from her forearms. Holmes uttered an exclamation. "You have other injuries, madam. What is this?" Two vivid red spots stood out on one of the white, round limbs. She hastily covered it. "It is nothing. It has no connection with this hideous business tonight. If you and your friend will sit down, I will tell you all I can. I am the wife of Sir Eustace Brackenstall. I have been married about a year. I suppose that it is no use my attempting to conceal that our marriage has not been a happy one. I fear that all our neighbours would tell you that, even if I were to attempt to deny it. Perhaps the fault may be partly mine. I was brought up in the freer, less conventional atmosphere of South Australia, and this English life, with its proprieties and its primness, is not congenial to me. But the main reason lies in the one fact which is notorious to everyone, and that is that Sir Eustace was a confirmed drunkard. To be with such a man for an hour is unpleasant. Can you imagine what it means for a sensitive and high-spirited woman to be tied to him for day and night? It is a sacrilege, a crime, a villainy to hold that such a marriage is binding. I say that those monstrous laws of yours will bring a curse upon the land. God will not let such wickedness endure." For an instant she sat up, her cheeks flushed and her eyes blazing from under the terrible mark upon her brow. Then the strong, soothing hand of the austere maid drew her head down onto the cushion, and the wild anger died away into passionate sobbing. At last she continued, "I would tell you that last night. You are aware, perhaps, that in this house all the servants sleep in the modern wing. This central block is made up of the dwelling rooms, with the kitchen behind and our bedroom above. My maid, Teresa, sleeps above my room. There is no one else, and no sound could alarm those who are in the farther wing. This must have been well known to the robbers, or they would not have acted as they did. Sir Eustace retired about 10:30. The servants had already gone to their quarters. Only my maid was up, and she had remained in her room at the top of the house until I needed her services. I sat until after 11 in this room, absorbed in a book. Then I walked round to see that all was right before I went upstairs. It was my custom to do this myself, for, as I have explained, Sir Eustace was not always to be trusted. I went into the kitchen, the butler's pantry, the gun room, the billiard room, the drawing room, and finally the dining room. As I approached the window, which is covered with thick curtains, I suddenly felt the wind blow upon my face and realized that it was open. I flung the curtain aside and found myself face to face with a broad-shouldered elderly man who had just stepped into the room. The window is a long French one, which really forms a door leading to the lawn. I held my bedroom candle lit in my hand, and by its light, behind the first man, I saw two others who were in the act of entering. I stepped back, but the fellow was on me in an instant. He caught me first by the wrist and then by the throat. I opened my mouth to scream, but he struck me a savage blow with his fist over the eye and felled me to the ground. I must have been unconscious for a few minutes, for when I came to myself, I found that they had torn down the bell rope and had secured me tightly to the oaken chair which stands at the head of the dining table. I was so firmly bound that I could not move, and a handkerchief round my mouth prevented me from uttering a sound. It was at this instant that my unfortunate husband entered the room. He had evidently heard some suspicious sounds, and he came prepared for such a scene as he found. He was dressed in nightshirt and trousers, with his favourite blackthorn cudgel in his hand. He rushed at the burglars, but another, it was the elderly man, stooped, picked the poker out of the grate, and struck him a horrible blow as he passed. He fell with a groan and never moved again. I fainted once more, but again it could only have been for a very few minutes, during which I was insensible. When I opened my eyes, I found that they had collected the silver from the sideboard and that they had drawn a bottle of wine which stood there. Each of them had a glass in his hand. I've already told you, have I not, that one was elderly, with a beard, and the others young, hairless lads. They might have been a father with his 2 sons. They talked together in whispers. Then they came over and made sure that I was securely bound. Finally they withdrew, closing the window after them. It was quite a quarter of an hour before I got my mouth free. When I did so, my screams brought the maids to my assistance. The other servants were soon alarmed, and we sent for the local police, who instantly communicated with London. That is really all I can tell you, gentlemen, and I trust that it will not be necessary for me to go over so painful a story again. Any questions, Mr. Holmes? Asked Hopkins. I will not impose any further tax upon Lady Brackenstall's patience and time, said Holmes. Before I go into the dining room, I should like to hear your experience. He looked at the maid. I saw the men before ever they came into the house, said she. As I sat by my bedroom window, I saw 3 men in the moonlight down by the lodge gate yonder, but I thought nothing of it at the time. It was more than an hour after that I heard my mistress scream, and down I ran to find her, poor lamb, just as she says, and him on the floor with his blood and brains over the room. It was enough to drive a woman out of her wits, tied there, and her very dress spotted with him. But she never wanted courage, did Miss Mary Fraser of Adelaide, and Lady Brackenstall of Abbey Grange hasn't learnt new ways. You've questioned her long enough, you gentlemen, and now she has come into her own room, just with her old Teresa, to get the rest that she badly needs. With a motherly tenderness, the gaunt woman put her arm round her mistress and led her from the room. She has been with her all her life, said Hopkins. Nursed her as a baby and came with her to England when they first left Australia 18 months ago. Teresa Wright is her name, and the kind of maid you don't pick up nowadays. This way, Mr. Holmes, if you please. The keen interest had passed